Welcome to Peoples and Things, where we explore human life with technology. I'm Lee Vinsel. Oh man, this is one of those episodes with one of those guests. So many possible roads in, so many possible soapboxes to stand on and shout the person's praises. I mean, we could do criti-hype, that goofy term I made up to describe talk and writing that masquerades as criticism, but really just boosts the hype around technologies and the firms that make them. Today's guest is an OG critic of criti-hype, especially when it comes to how technologies affect young people. Or methods, another one of my obsessions. Today's guest is a very serious practitioner of social science method who really does the work. She doesn't mess around on that front. But here at Peoples and Things, we're always looking to broaden our horizons, to branch out. And here's a soapbox I don't think I've spent too much time on. At least not on the show. A couple years ago, I was going to give a talk titled Accounting for Computers at SIGSIS, the world's foremost computer history organization. And that talk was intended to examine how we still lack a historical description, explanation, and account for how our adoption of digital technologies has affected our society and economy. And actually, I was talking to today's guest about that presentation as I was writing it because her work is really insightful in this area. Now, unfortunately, I had to cancel that appearance because my kids came down with the flu, and I could just hear from the tone in my wife's voice and the look in her eyes that abandoning my family to go hang out and have fun at a conference with a bunch of my technology studies nerd friends was not going to make me any friends in the Vinselton household. But accounting for computers was to be a kind of challenge to the computer history community, because here's a funny thing. As you may have heard before, in 1987, the economist Robert Solow wrote something that came to be known as the productivity paradox or the Solow paradox. He wrote, "You can see the computer age everywhere but in the productivity statistics," end quote. In other words, computers promise to be revolutionary technologies, and yet with a brief exception in the 1990s that's sometimes called the new economy, computers didn't seem to be making the US economy that much more efficient. And outside that exceptional new economy moment, that has remained true right up to today. Lots of hype around digital technologies, and yet productivity growth has remained relatively stagnant. And for a while there, a few years ago, was even negative. Now, I could go on for a long time about why digital technologies haven't boosted productivity more. My take is that if you think through the issue in a deep way and examine what it's like dealing with ordinary and mediocre and downright shitty computers and software in work settings, the productivity paradox isn't at all surprising. In fact, it's not even a paradox because it's just kind of obvious. But then this line of thinking could lead you to another conclusion, which would go something like this. All of these digital technologies that we've adopted in our lives and work, they just haven't had any effect at all, have they? But concluding that would be madness, wouldn't it? I mean, a lot of things have changed since like the 1980s when it comes to how we use digital technologies in our lives, haven't they? But if so, what has changed, and how, and why? Now, honestly, I think that historians of computing haven't had much to teach us about this topic. They have let us down on this topic for several reasons, but the biggest one is that they have focused way too much on histories of invention and innovation and intellectual histories of computing geniuses and so on and so forth. And they have given us very few studies of how individuals and organizations adopt and use technologies in daily routines. But the effects of technologies come from use. Now, I'm not going to say that studying the history of digital technology use is simple. It's damn hard. Archivally, studying invention is just a lot easier, a hell of a lot easier. But until historians of computing turn to the study of digital technology use in homes and workplaces, they simply cannot help us account for computers and their economic and social effects. Now, I do think there are a few histories that at least give us glimmers of the right roads to go down. To name a few, I think James Cortada's 3-volume history, The Digital Hand, has a great deal to teach us, as does Jeffrey Yost's Making IT Work, a history of the digital services industry. But where else could we turn? Well, I think one really important place to look, and this might especially be true of kind of like the non-work effects of digital technologies, is to ethnographies and interview-based studies in which scholars have studied how people use digital technologies in their daily lives. And so, like, one book I like on this front is Judy Weissman's Pressed for Time, The Acceleration of Life in Digital Capitalism. To give a sense of one thing Weissman found in her research, she found that people use digital technologies to shift work into what used to be their off-work private time, like answering emails at night and on weekends. Does that sound familiar? Holy Christ, what a fucking nightmare! Or another great book on the use of digital technology in daily life is, well, it's complicated. The Social Lives of Network Teens by today's guest, Danah Boyd, a partner researcher at Microsoft Research and a distinguished visiting professor at Georgetown University. In my opinion, Danah is a master researcher. She's a really hardcore empiricist while also being creative conceptually and theoretically. Whether it's hanging out with and interviewing teens about their actual lives with digital technology and what they're like, as opposed to, say, what adults' worried fantasies about what their lives are like, or it's Danah's more recent work on digital infrastructures in the US Census Bureau, which you'll learn more about in the interview, she gives us a masterclass in how to study digital technology in ordinary daily life. And I think historians of computing should take this kind of stuff seriously. And maybe I'll even suggest that historians of computing should study the notes and data that ethnographers, interviewers, and other social scientists have created as a method for accounting for computing. Danah Boyd has ever increasingly become a real role model for me in recent years. And she is an exemplar that I point students to when I'm explaining how to do technology studies well. Danah is also simply a hoot. I had a lot of fun balancing with her on this particular soapbox, and I hope you enjoy our conversation. Hey, yo, hey! Get excited! Danah, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Thanks for having me.
Can you tell me, partner researcher at Microsoft Research, what's that mean? What do you do?
Yeah. So Microsoft Research is part of a longer history of industrial research labs. And we can think about some of the famous ones of past, AT&T's Bell Labs, Xerox PARC, Corning has one. They come from a bunch of different environments. They've historically been much more directed in the world of invention, of intellectual property, right?
Yeah.
So, in case of something like Microsoft, it would be, thinking about computer science. But one of the things that I had the fortune of being able to help create at Microsoft was a team that was actually much more focused on socio-technical practices.
Yeah.
And the goal there was just saying, like, hey, you guys can invent all sorts of futures, but if you don't understand, what the world looks like, they're going to land poorly.
Yeah.
And so as a researcher, like my life looks like a professor's life. I do research, I publish papers. It's just that instead of teaching 18-year-olds, I spend a lot of time teaching, executives and being like,
Okay.
so maybe we need to learn something different today. It's like, here's Social 101 again.
I like it. Well, I was gonna. Does it also mean? I mean, are you doing a lot of like secret proprietary research that some like most of us never see that side of it? Or do you do work like that too? No.
No. So the thing that's interesting about Microsoft research is because it comes out of this intellectual property tradition, so much of it is about inventing, systems, if you
Yeah.
will, versus
Sure.
what you saw in terms of the internet technology. So their research labs like Google or Facebook, they have a big, really applied team who is
Social
doing proprietary
psychologists
research.
and stuff like that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I haven't been. I mean, I've spent the last, 5 years looking at the US Census Bureau,
Yeah.
and I'm going to be working on a book about it.
Uh-huh.
And that's great, but the relevance to Microsoft is that I'm trying to think about data infrastructures, which
Okay.
you know really well.
Yeah.
But it's not. They don't need to know about the census,
Right,
right? They're
right.
like census, but data infrastructures, right? The underlying ideas are what become relevant as they're thinking about AI.
Yeah, that's cool. And I mean, part of the legacy of Xerox PARC in my mind is that there were some, social scientists around, like what Suchman was there. Is that right? And
They're absolutely. You think about Lucy Suchman, right?
yeah. And I always, because I interviewed Steve Barley. I don't know if you've ever met. Yeah, I figured as much. And he was saying that one of the reasons he moved from Cornell to Stanford when he did that back in the 90s, I think, was that Park was around and there were cool, organizational folks around, basically. So, I mean, do you ever think about that legacy? Do you see that connection or?
I do. And I mean, I still love conversing with Lucy. Like, we actually still have these, multi-generational conversations about industrial research that are, I mean, I saw her at 4S, and that was just sort of a delight, which is, the major science and technology studies conference,
Yeah.
as you know. And, I think that each of us who've gone through one of these, crazy beasts, we've learned different things.
Yes.
But there's something about being closer to the machine, right, that is actually helpful. So even if I'm not studying the rollout of a particular technology, which I'm like, okay,
Right.
it's more, I understand and I can bring that. And so then when I switch into a lot of academic conversations, people will manifest these, fantasies of how these
Exactly.
technologies are built.
I know, man.
And I'm like, I mean, and that kills me
It does,
because
yeah.
as an ethnographer, I'm like, you have to be grounded.
Yeah.
And so for me, it's been great because it keeps me aware. And, to be clear, before Microsoft Research, I also worked, on product teams, in industry. So I had a familiarity, and I have a computer science degree, which is how I was legible in a place like MSR. So it's been an interesting journey to go through this, but I do, and I value people who can actually talk about it. So this is the thing I always talk to, my Stanford colleagues about, is that even if they're at Stanford as their main institution, they're also just have a level of peripheral awareness of what's going on in the industry that it's harder to have in different geographies.
Yeah, I'm with you. And I think this theme of being grounded is going to play out through our conversation, I think. So I want to at least briefly talk about your book, It's Complicated, The Social Lives of Teens. I know we don't want to have to spend, a lot of time in the good old days, but, for me, it is a classic and important work of social science, of technology. And I just wanted to go back and, one of the fun things I like to do is like, if you were to explain it to a stranger now, what It's Complicated was about and what you were trying to do, what would you tell them?
It's funny to bring this book back up at this moment because there is a whole new wave of anxiety about the current generation, parental and adult anxiety.
This new Jonathan Haidt book, for instance. Yeah.
For example. The thing that I was trying to do with that book was explain young people's lives from their own vantage point. And some of the young people were fine. They're doing perfectly okay. Some are having a grand old mess, and the technology is just one part in a milieu of chaos.
Mm-hmm.
And so I took the book, and it was different from my dissertation because I totally reworked it to break it down based on myths that people had about young people and technology. And I used, the ethnographic material that I'd collected, the voices of young people, to try to unpack what those myths are and what they look like for young people, right?
Yeah.
And so, even something like addiction, it's funny to go back to it today, of course. Teenagers then were complaining about their parents' addiction as parents were complaining about their kids' addiction. And it's like, okay, what is this about, right? Because parents would be like, I'm fine, I don't have a problem with my phone. And kids were like, have you met her? Right? Like, so this sort of keeping it real, keeping it grounded in young people's perspectives. And I think that becomes really important right now because there absolutely is a mental health crisis. Very
Yes.
different than where I was a decade ago. And it's it is complicated, but it's also, playing out in all sorts of really interesting and complex ways. Now, there's certain things we know about mental health. For example, when adults aren't doing well, the kids are often not doing well, and adults are not doing well right now, right? And I'm struck by something that I really didn't document as well in that book. I make reference to it, but it's one of those areas that I'm like, oh, I wish I could go back. I talked about young people not having access to public spaces, right? And that was a transition that had happened over a long period of time. And that is true and is continued. But I didn't focus as much on all of the important non-custodial roles that adults had in young people's lives, the coaches and the pastors and the, aunties and the mentors and all of those folks, because that was also declining then and is devastated right now.
Interesting.
And
Huh.
COVID destroyed it.
Huh.
And this scares me because one of the things is that when you're trying to do a de-escalation on a suicide attempt, one of the most crucial parts of that is to figure out people that a young person can talk to support them, namely adults, usually non-custodial adults, because usually parents aren't always so helpful.
Yeah.
And we are just seeing over and over again young people being like, I have nobody. And you're like, this isn't good. This is really not good.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that, I didn't pay as much attention to then, I had paid attention, obviously, to the mass school shootings and Columbine and the stress and anxiety that was going on about having to do, hide under your desk stuff. But after Trayvon Martin was murdered, I really underestimated how much parents of Black and brown kids would really push to keep their kids indoors to keep them safe.
Right.
So these are the kinds of things. So there's certain things that I kind of had inklings of, but didn't really focus on. And so I keep thinking about pulling forward. What are the places where I stand by that book, and I feel like the anxieties that are there are still there, right? Like they're back there with a vengeance. And because we don't center young people, we tend to center tech. We tend to look at the wrong things, and that just gives me so much pain.
Amen. One of the things that I think of you as a very serious methods person. You do a lot of work and especially for it's complicated. You did, I don't know, hundreds of interviews. I didn't, yeah, and
officially hundreds.
And so, that's one thing I really like about your work. But how did you kind of get into it? How did you come to write the dissertation before? I liked how you talked about how you kind of reformed things. But how did you initially get started down that road?
So, I started as a computer scientist and, went to my first PhD program thinking that I was going to do visualization work. I was really interested in graphics. And I was really interested in visualizing networks. And so that led me to obsessively focus on the sociological literature and social network analysis.
Interesting.
And I took, these amazing methods class trying to understand how to do network analysis. And I should note my undergrad thesis ended up being a psychological experiment study where I learned that I hate running psych experiments. But that's a whole other conversation. So I was doing this visualization work, and then I dropped out of my first PhD program. And in a fit of rage, which is a whole other conversation. And then I went to, let's be honest, I was drinking in New Orleans when my undergrad advisor threatened me and told me to go back to grad school. And he introduced me to my advisor, who was a political scientist. And I showed up in California and we started talking. And, he was at that stage in his career where he was just like, oh, I just want to learn from like my grad students because that's just fun.
Yeah.
And so he was just really playful. And we were talking about different things. I had, in my first program, I had gone to work for Genevieve Bell for a summer. She had taught me the basics of like ethnography as a method. And I was like, this is fascinating. And then my advisor, Peter Lyman, he was an ethnographer. And so I was like, doing all of this work, trying to make sense of these early social network sites.
Yes.
Right. Because I had dropped out at the time that Friendster had just launched. And for me, these were network analysis games.
Yeah.
So I was originally doing visualization and network analysis and trying to understand it. And then as I got into my PhD program, I was like, you know what? I'm going to take a break from studying these like social network site things and go be more serious. Great logic of my years. And I was like, I'm going to go study young people and their engagement with technology because I was a queer kid growing up online. And so I thought of the internet as amazing. And so I was like, I'm going to go study young people. And I was like, just at the like moment in which they jumped onto MySpace. And so it was like, oh, apparently I'm not going to leave behind these things. And so it's very funny because I ended up, there was the stuff that I was doing, tracking and tracing the early social network sites, methodologically was all over the place. I was running focus groups for, different competitive startups who wanted to understand what was happening in these systems. I was, conducting all of these different interviews for clients, trying to understand different dynamics that were happening, which is how I first started doing stuff about trust and safety, for example.
Uh-huh.
So I was doing all of this other work. And then I thought about what I wanted to do with my dissertation. And I was like, you know what? I'm just going to go deep. I'm just going to go spend time with young people, attend Friday night football games and like hang out in certain geographies in malls and, and then interview people. And so that's why I say officially, because there was a lot of stuff that I was doing for clients that was different, but constantly fed in my perspective. And the other thing that's less visible in that book is that I was still doing all sorts of quantitative network analysis and sense making, specifically on MySpace and Facebook as it was coming up. But I ended up not. I mean, that was less relevant to the arguments. It was just background, but it kept me grounded in what was going on.
I love that story, which I did not know. And I think part of it is it kind of helps me. I was going to ask, because you have 2 co-authored books in the, around the same time, Hanging Out, Messing Around, Geeking Out, Kids Living and Learning with New Media, and then Participatory Culture in a Networked Era. And I think that the story you tell just kind of really nicely shows what you were up to during that period the network analysis piece is not something I realized, but it makes a lot of sense of the whole thing. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and it's interesting because so my advisor, Peter, who I just loved to pieces, he unfortunately died of brain cancer while I was working my dissertation. And so Mimi Ito ended up adopting me. And Mimi and Peter at the time had coordinated this big group ethnography, right? So this is the whole thing about hanging out, messing around, and geeking out, is that this was a group ethnography where each of us were doing different field sites and constantly coming back and sharing and iterating. How cool. Which was also just delightful.
Yeah.
Right. And again, people were writing their own pieces as well, but this book was an attempt to come together. And then the participatory culture was that Henry was one of my, was on my committee in my first PhD program, the one I dropped out of. And so I knew him for a long time. And then Mimi, of course. And the 3 of us just decided we wanted to process all that we had been like dealing with because, Mimi is the perennial optimist, right? And Henry is like the perennial geek. And I mean that in the most loving of loving ways. And he's like, ooh. And I had sort of ended up with the 2 of them as being like, the person who was always like, oh, do you want to hear about a horror story over here? Like, you want to see what's going wrong? And they're both like, can we just focus on what's going right? And I'm like, no. So we ended up having this moment of just trying to process.
Yeah.
And that book is the product of our attempts to process with each other what we had gone through in that period.
Yeah.
And part of it for me was that I knew that I was going to be shifting focus away from the stuff that I had been doing in order to go into the privacy and what would become, AI and big data
Mm-hmm.
conversations.
Well, that's so neat. I mean, and on the first part, the kind of group ethnography thing, I just feel like there's too little stuff like that going on. It's like we need big projects, actually. Um,
Oh, and it's
yeah,
so delightful.
yeah,
Like, I mean, this is I'm a sucker for it. Like I love iteratively thinking, and it's interesting because through MSR, Nancy Baim and Neha Shah and I have just funded a small team doing work or ethnographic studies of how AI is playing out on the ground in different
nice,
organizations.
nice.
And so it's actually this really great moment because, you know, Melissa Masmanian and Beth Batchkey have this great study that they're doing in Hollywood.
Mm-hmm.
And, Hatim Rahman has this great study he's doing in a hospital and looking at,
Beautiful.
what's going on in insurance. And, Melissa Valentine is looking at how things are rolling out in, legal firms and other places. And Maura Weigel is looking at
Oh yeah,
what it looks like in retail. And we just come together and are trying to talk through,
yeah,
with respect, right? The goal isn't to like steal each other's work,
nah.
but just be like, have you seen this strange thing?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
I'm still
yeah.
doing the public sector stuff. So it's just like, how do you make sense of this? And what does this look like in your world? And
Yep.
I just feel like it's more generative. And I guess the thing for me is that research, we're so lucky, right? Like this is such a joy.
Yeah.
And, I came to this work because I just love doing it. I love reading. I love thinking, and being able to do it as a team, activity is just the best thing
Yep.
ever.
No, I hear you. And I can't wait to see the product of that. I mean, since like, I wrote this piece last summer about kind of decision making around AI hype, but one of the points I made in that piece is like we really just don't know what's going on in organizations yet, and the only way we're going to know is the kind of stuff you all are up to. So, we'll see
Yeah,
aggregate measures of it and stuff, but this is the stuff we need. So I'm excited about
I
that.
know. I mean, just hearing the cultural logics. I mean, and this goes back to, you've been doing collaborative work, right? Like, what got you to do collaborative work?
Oh, I feel like I mostly just fell into it, which is how it happens. But then, like, it's really kind of thinking about how big good things get done. So I think it's like reading some of Pierre Bourdieu's famous studies and realizing there were entire teams involved. To bring up Steve Barley again, he had a bunch of folks working on technicians back in the early 90s that turned into a fascinating study. So I've just really been thinking about like the practice of social science. I mean, like, you just need more team projects going on if we're going to, do this stuff, frankly. So, yeah.
It's just joy. It's joyous. I mean, to be able to process, interviews and field data with somebody else and think through what you see and to see different angles of it. I mean,
Yeah.
that's oh, yum 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 yum.
Yes. And I wanted to bring up a more recent piece, which is related in my head to It's Complicated, which is this piece. Is it Maria Angel? Is that yeah,
Yeah, Maria Angel. Yeah.
yeah, you wrote this essay, Techno-Legal Solutionism, Regulating Children's Online Safety in the United States. And yeah, well, I mean, just tell people about the piece and then we can chat about it a bit.
Sure. So Maria is a legal scholar whose work mostly focuses on privacy.
Mm-hmm.
And she came to play with me for a summer and we started talking about different things. And I was like, it was at a time where all of this angst about children was coming back up, in part because Congress had failed to pass general purpose privacy. It attempted. And so, like Congress often does, and especially in the 1990s, it shifts from things that are general purpose to kids these
Yeah,
days. And
right.
it's like always seen as this thing that can be done across the aisle. And I was furious about this bill for a bunch of reasons that are, sort of more political in nature, which is to say that, you have the co-sponsor of it arguing that she's putting this forward because she wants to protect, you know, children from, and I quote, the transgender,
Right, right.
and the idea that this would stop kids from, and I quote, indoctrination. And I was like losing my mind all over all of this. And she pointed out to me, she's like, no, I understand you're angry at all these things, but she's like, look, there's something else interesting going on. Check out this duty of care provision, which is, and she's like, there's something really interesting here happening. And so when she calmed me down and started having me look through this, I agreed with her, right? Because we've seen all of these different attempts to regulate young people, and this seemed like an interesting shift. And there was a shift coming out of the UK, which has a very different approach to things. But it struck me because, with all of our STS orientation, I was sitting here going, wait a minute, like we've been complaining about, companies engaging in techno-solutionist logics for so long, right? They have a technological fix to everything, and they're just going to magically cure cancer and fix climate change and all of these other things, which is maddening. And then, and I've been barking at it about, many of my peers, which is like my world had shifted into, well, technology, causes destruction of democracy, technology, and it was just as deterministic.
Yes.
And I was like, why is our field becoming as deterministic as the industry? Like, I get the isomorphic tendency, but this is not good.
Yeah, right.
And I was just like, this is insane. And so then I realized that, like, we were going back and forth with the bill, that what was happening was that the policymakers, had come to conclude that because technology caused the harm, because clearly they had intentionally designed it to cause harm to young people, that they could be legally required to force those companies into causing goodness. And I was like, whoa. And so this was when, Maria pointed out, like, this is, her term, techno-legal solutionism, which is like, what happens when the law takes technological determinism, takes a technological fix and demands it. And that's weird for so many reasons.
Yes.
Because it's not only untractable, like, asking a tech company to be like, stop young people from having mental duress. That's nuts.
Yeah.
The news causes mental duress. So I'm like, what does this mean? But it also is this fascinating moment. It's like, why are you also trying to empower these companies to solve large, complex societal issues? Aren't you upset that they have so much power?
Yeah.
Like, that seems really like a weird, reconfiguration. And also, like, why are you so convinced of the malevolent causality of a lot of this stuff? And I was just like, I'm just baffled. So this was our attempt. And so this is published in ACM CS and Law, which is an attempt to bring computer scientists and legal scholars together, which is like sort of a neat, newish venue. And because it's like this moment of just like, wait a minute, what happens? Like, law just tends to be as solutionistic as tech industry. So what does that mean, that we have to think about the relationship between these? So we hope that intervention helps people start to see why these proposed technological fixes are not constructive.
Yeah.
And they don't hold tech companies accountable, and they certainly won't help vulnerable youth.
Mm-hmm. No, I totally agree with you. And you all cite some great literature that I was reading on, when we do like real serious analyses of what we know about the relationship between digital technology and teen mental health or mental health in general. It turns out it's very complicated and not obvious in any way. I wanted to ask you, I mean, this is kind of a broad philosophical question, but it's something I've been thinking a lot about. Where do you sit on like how much power designers of like smartphone apps and stuff like that have over our behavior? Because like I see like I have real questions. Like, I'm not saying there's nothing going on, but like I often see this assumption that like they have a shit ton of power, and I'm like, I don't know. Like I really like that I'm sorry, Tim Huang's book on ads, for instance, shows that like we don't click into them. So I don't, you know what I mean? Like there's as many kind of like things pushing in the opposite direction for me. So I don't know. Just where do you sit on that these days?
So first off, there's a long, history of media effects,
right?
That has, keeps resurfacing new forms every couple decades, and I've found a lot of it to be methodologically dubious.
Yeah.
At the same time, I recognize that there are moments, and so I often come to a spectrum approach to it.
Mm-hmm.
So the place that I use is sort of, at the extreme end of it is the old work that we know on suicide, which is that if you are already experiencing a state of anomie, and you are imagining and envisioning yourself dying by suicide as a way of coping with that mental duress, the having somebody lay out to you that it's acceptable, that this is something that can make sense, can often be a real triggering factor.
Mm-hmm.
And so we used to see this in terms of like whenever the news covers celebrities who die by suicide, we see significant impact, into the data on this. Likewise, like, I was on the board for 10 years of a mental health organization called Crisis Text Line, which I adore. And, we would struggle because like the 13 Reasons Why show was a nightmare for us, right? Because we not only did we see the flood of it, but we saw all these young people that were referencing it, and we were like, oh my gosh, how do we make it stop? The thing is that 13 Reasons Why was watched by millions and millions of people who were unaffected and thought it was really an interesting show. That really talked about complexities of bullying. But for a small number of people, it was just the final straw.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Yeah.
And so this is where, when I look at all of this, there is something about what it means to be in a state of vulnerability that, makes certain triggers very clear. And so like another example for me, is the full analysis of what happened with Dylan Roof, right? Who we usually are able to highlight as somebody who's been radicalized. And by all intents and purposes, he was. But you're talking also about a kid who was really struggling with belonging and with identity and with all of these other things that the white nationalist group who brought him in very much gave him a sense of belonging. And this is what we know about cults, what we know about religion, what we know about gangs. It turns out when you're not well, you somebody gives you a lifeline that comes with a sense of belonging.
Right.
I mean,
QAnon too, right? It makes
QAnon, multi-level marketing.
Yeah.
There's so many of these things. And so this is where it's tricky for me, because I always come back and it's just like, how do we start to look out for and build safety nets for the most vulnerable populations? Rather than like, it's thinking that if we just block this vertical of radicalization, it will all end. And so for me, like I go back to what I used to see in the 90s, where we had street outreach programs. And I don't remember these, but like, where people who were struggling usually with crack addiction would be given clean needles, sometimes heroin as well, would be given clean needles and access to resources about where they could get help. They weren't arrested. They weren't like picked up and sent to a facility. It was about helping them come back and build connective tissue through somebody who cared, right? Who came out on the street on a regular basis and checked in on them. And I've been arguing for, about 20 years now that I really want digital street outreach programs. And the thing about my own youth is that I lived through a digital street outreach experience, right? So I was a queer kid raging against the machine in all sorts of ways. And I would go on late at night after my mother was asleep and be all over the internet saying all stupid shit. And I still remember these two people. One was a trans-identified woman and one was a gay guy, who were both just willing to answer ridiculous questions and talk about their own experiences. And they held me and in an emotional way. They were like, it wasn't just it gets better. It was like, hey, I'm here for you. Do you want to talk tomorrow night? I'll be here tomorrow night again. And like these moments, I'm like, I don't know who they are. I don't know if their professed identities were real, but I know the impact they had on my life was constructive and generative, and they weren't engaged in radicalization. They were just helping me be okay with myself. And I think about that, and it's like, when I talk to, especially young queer kids, they don't have that online. It's like a world of toxic attacks. And so like, what does it mean if we would actually build programs that would accept where people are at and be like, I can hold you through this crisis? And that's, of course, what we tried to build with Crisis Text Line, but that's where people reach out to us. So I want the inverse. I want the ability to reach out and be like, hey, you doing okay? Like, I'm worried about you.
No, I like that as a response, and it connects to what you all say in the end of that techno-legal solutionism paper, which is that we need more focus on kind of like social solutions to these, and not pretend that by flipping some switch we're going to get somewhere. When I was talking to a mutual friend of ours about having you on, I said, I'm going to talk to Danah. It's going to be lots of fun. She said she's only going to want to talk to you about the census. That's it. It's like, so I mean, so tell. So you did check. I mean, I think you kind of set it up earlier. Is you started thinking you started tacking towards like big data. That was the hot topic, and AI. But how did you get onto the census as like the thing you were going to explore? When you have a couple different pieces, you have a piece with multiple, but Jayshree Sarathi, your colleague, and then Dan Bauk, wonderful dude. So yeah, tell us how you got onto the census.
Yeah. So the funny thing is, so after I started Data and Society, I was really focusing on getting all sorts of other people to do amazing research. And I wasn't really driving my own research agenda for multiple years. It
Mm-hmm.
was more like, how do I help everybody
Yeah.
else and identify and scale? And that was amazing. And then I got to a point where I'm like, I want to do research
Yeah,
again.
right.
And it was sort of that whimpery feeling that you get as a scholar where you're like, but I don't like administration. I like
Yeah.
research. And so I got to this point where I was like, okay, I've got to figure something out. So I was feeling around and trying to figure it out. And I was like, okay, AI is going to be the next big thing. What part of this do I want to deal with? Because this is going to be cacophonous and annoying. And so the thing that was interesting is that I had a whole team at Data and Society who was doing really important work on media manipulation and different aspects we now call disinformation.
Yep.
And we'd been tagging different things and working together. And I'd been in a lot of the environs with them. And it's October of 2016. And we're all sort of staring down different white nationalist groups, trying to figure out what the heck's going on. And I start seeing a whole coordinated conversation amongst white nationalists to talk about how they can manipulate the 2020 US Census. And I was like, what? Like, what? I don't get it. And at that time, I was on an Obama era FACA that was like a committee that was like looking at the Census Bureau's data projects. And so I had these interactions with all of the different Commerce Department groups. And I had been talking to people, including the Census, including NOAA, different places that are part of Commerce Department. And so I'd seen all this stuff in October. And later that month, I had a meeting with all of these people, including the then director of the Census Bureau. And I was like, look, I'm seeing all this crazy stuff and I really don't understand what's going on. But I think you guys should pay attention to it. And you're not going to believe me. But will you please call me once Trump wins? And Trump is not going to win. I'm like, I know, everybody tells me that. Will you please just promise that when he does, you will call me? That's all I ask. And to his credit, he did. And I went down and met with all of these different government employees and like, look, here's what's going on with a whole slew of white nationalists. Here's what they're aiming to do. And I was like, great, bye. And they're like, no, help us. We don't know how to deal with this. And I'm like, I don't know how to deal with it either. But, push came to shove, I started doing this sort of different volunteer work, helping them with different pieces of it, and that's a much longer story. But eventually, 9 months into this, no, about 9 months into this, I was like, so I'm going to take a break from this because I want to go back to research. And the then deputy director, who is the highest ranking career, who is an economist, is like, well, what do you want to actually research? Like, what are you doing? I'm like, well, I'm thinking about data infrastructures and how they play a role and what they'll mean for all of these decision making.
Yeah.
We're having all these conversations about bias. We're having these conversations about, gaps. But I really want to think about like, what makes a data, infrastructure legitimate in the first place? I'm like, because the legitimacy seems to be, really challenging me. And he just glares at me and he's like, and why would you not do that here? And I'm like, because I stupidly never thought of it. And he was like, I'll let you have access. What do you need? And I'm like, so I'm an ethnographer. Can I become a professional meeting attender of your organization? And he's like, yeah, what do you want to come? Come to whatever you want. And I was like, really? Oh my gosh. Right. And so, of course, that's just, ethnographer candy, where it's just like, I can go to meetings. And so, I started going down there and I was looking at 3 areas in particular. I was looking at all of the communication stuff that was happening, because the thing to understand about communication in a federal agency is that it's run by a political. So there's a lot of pent up anxiety and frustration amongst the civil servants about what they want to communicate, but they can't communicate. So these amazing communication challenges that create legitimacy crises. And then and then I was on, this whole team that was trying to think about quality assurance, right? Like, how do you make certain that the data is good, right?
Yeah.
Like, because that's at the heart of the mission, and they do all sorts of really interesting things. And then I was also working on this privacy protection effort. So the Census Bureau likes to publish as much data as it can, but it also needs to maintain, the commitment of the public who have to participate, who are afraid of government publishing their data, especially, again, vulnerable populations, right? Like undocumented individuals, people who are living outside of, their landlords, rules, all sorts of different populations.
Rural
and so
folks,
there's
yeah.
this effort yeah, this effort to go through a modernization process, in part because they realized that the previous techniques didn't work. And so they started implementing differential privacy, which was a political nightmare in all sorts of messy ways. And so it was great to have these like different vantage points to watch this. I was really excited. I had moved to DC in February of 2020 in order to do field work at the core, like in order to be on site for the core of 2020. And of course, that would change on March 12th, 2020, when everything would become Skype for Business. And so I was a professional Skype meeting attender, but I still got to do a lot of the different field work with different folks.
That's cool.
And I'm now trying to write it up, which is all fun. But it was also like, you mentioned the papers with Dan and J Street.
Yeah.
There's also a more recent paper with Jennifer Teshi, who's done great ethnographic work inside NASA. And one of the things we wrote in this new paper was most of the org's work really talks about how a technical crisis leads to a legitimacy crisis, right? Like, a shuttle exploding, right? Like, a nuclear reactor sort of falling apart. Like a lot of the literature is really there.
Yeah.
And we were interested in how legitimacy crises got manufactured and helped trigger technical vulnerabilities. And so we started looking at how, if you think about resources as a knob,
yes,
that manipulation of the resources of these public sector technical organizations could help trigger these legitimacy crises and really affect it in ways that then can create downstream technical crises. And so in that place, I also looked at the mess of the schedule and the control of the schedule for the Census Bureau.
That's really nice.
Fun.
Yeah, I mean, Reagan and these characters, just starve an agency of resources long enough and you'll start to have all kinds of technical problems and deaths and stuff. So
I think one of the things we were fascinated is money is obviously part of the history, but part of why we ended up focusing and putting a lot of my piece in there is you can also create a weaponization of time.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And that's one of the things that's just sort of also fascinating because something like the census, it has a schedule.
Right. Right.
One that was demanded by the Constitution.
Yeah.
And so what does it mean to play with that? Mm-hmm. As a resource, in addition to the austerity politics that we know so well.
That's nice. Can we go back and talk about the foundation of data in society? I don't know that I've ever heard you tell that story. So how'd that happen?
So I was at Microsoft Research, and like I said earlier, like I've always had the freedom to do research, but that doesn't mean that some people don't get angry at me. And so there was a set of situations that happened in 2011 where a lot of people inside the company were just angry at the things I was saying publicly. And so at one part of these conversations, I looked at this executive and I'm like, look, nobody's willing to be honest with you. Everybody is, always tells you what they think you want to know. And you end up having a blinkered view of what's going on in the world. And like, you get upset with me when I tell you something's going to happen because it's going to happen. And I'm watching it play out because I'm embedded in that environment and you're not paying attention because your staff is telling you not to. And I'm like, you need a better way of understanding the fights that are happening about privacy. And he came back to me, to his credit, and said, all right, where are the academics, the institutions, the institutes that I should fund that are doing this combination of things? And I was like, well, there's, Berkman's doing this, and here's things that are happening at individual researchers that are doing amazing things. And I made this map. And my boss looks at me and is like, you have wanted and argued that, there should be more coherent institutions to handle a lot of these tech and society issues for a long time. This is an opening. And so I went back to him and I was like, hey, look, I'll build something, but it's got to be an independent institution. I would need money to get it started, and then I'll fundraise independently. And it's going to say things you don't like. Are you game? And he was like, okay. And I was like, really? Seriously? I was like, so I was given the startup money to basically kickstart this. And really try to figure out which projects and areas I wanted to tackle. I knew that, it needed to be about different aspects of technology and society. I knew that I wanted to pay attention to what was going to happen at the time. It was called big data. And so I was like, okay, data and society, because actually it's because I have no creativity in naming things. So I was like, here's something. And, I put out this call so the first thing we did was, oh my gosh, after almost moments after having kickstarted this as a crazy plan, I get a call from friends inside the Office of Science and Technology Policy at the White House, and they're like, "So we're going to have these like conferences and events, and we know who's going to host the big data and law one, and we know who's going to do the big data and technology one, but we need one that's like big data and ethics and cultural thing. Can you do that?" I was like, "Sure." I have no idea what I'm doing, but sure, I can figure it out. And so that ended up becoming like, I think we thought through like, what should that first event look like that, would create a sense of change. And one of the things we did with it was like, we decided we wanted to have primers, and primers were like, okay, let's get everybody in the room from all these different worlds on the same page. We are researchers after all. They're not going to read the academic papers, but we can probably put together these like mini reads. And so I remember, hiring Tamara Nice and hiring Alex Rosenblatt and being like, can we build these primers in record speed and put together this event? And the result is that this ended up creating connections across all of these different places that was a really solid foundation. And that would lead to like the data and civil rights efforts and all of these things that we would do later on. And then the other cool thing about it is we also put out a fellows call around that time, and which is like, we have no idea what this institute really is. It has like amorphous, and we just got these amazing people who were like, yeah, I'm kind of a misfit toy over here and a misfit toy over there. And I was like, come be misfit toys together. And so it was this great moment of just like, how do we build, a network of misfit toys who can sort of reach out into the world? And I very much in those early days thought of it not really in an organizational sense, but in a network sense. So it was really built with a network first approach where people would come in and then they would go back out. They would do postdocs, and it was, it was fun. But it also then, of course, it turned into an organization, and then somehow I became the
I had
manager.
that happen to me, a much smaller one. I decided that wasn't for me, but
yeah, me too. Which is why I originally was going to depart from part of building up the census work was that I was planning on leaving in the fall of 2020. And the organization I felt was really solid. It was sturdy. It was doing amazing work, and I was ready to hand it off. And then 2020 was 2020.
Yeah.
So that didn't make sense. Because I didn't. The point was not to leave the organization in a lurch. And then I sort of came to the board. I'm like, look, at the 10-year mark in which I was working on it, I'm going to walk away. I think y'all are good.
Yeah.
I don't think you need me. Like, I want to cheerlead. I want to be really excited. I want to attend the lectures. I want to do things, but I don't want to be in charge.
Yeah.
And so it was, it was sort of this interesting thing where people were like, you're going to walk away. And I'm like, yeah.
Yeah, it's got to happen.
Like, founders are weird and creepy and strange figures.
Totally.
Like, organizations need a life. If they matter, they need to exist beyond the founder. So I'm excited for it. I love what Data Study is doing. It's, it's different than what I was focused on. That's great.
Yeah.
The team is so amazing. There's so many amazing people there. So
it's been
win-win for everyone.
It's been such a wonderful institution, and it's supported so many people. I think people who were not traditionally supported by academia often. Very important for a lot of young women and queer people and people of color. I think that was obviously a central value of the organization. So it's been a great thing. So thank you for doing the work back in the day.
Oh, I'm glad.
So I was doing a little Danah Boyd lit review in preparation of talking to you today, and I found a piece that I haven't even had a chance to read yet, but it's called "Situating Methods and the Magic of Big Data and Artificial Intelligence." And you wrote it with Madeline Claire Eilish, who's someone who I really respect. She co-wrote, I can't remember the co-author's piece, but it was a data and society piece on AI. It was like AI in the real world or something like that.
It was repair work, I think is what the title was, or something related to that. And it was with Elizabeth Watkins.
Okay. Yeah. And so I haven't had a chance to hang out with Madeline enough, but I need to at some point, and I really appreciate her work. But I've been writing a piece called Methods in Technology Studies recently, and so I was really happy to find this piece, which says a lot of the same things I am saying in this thing. And in the abstract for it, you guys talk about how big data and AI are like really hot, and they've captured the public imagination. But then you say these really interesting things. You say, through an interrogation of the histories, perceptions, and practices that shape these technologies, we problematize the myths that animate the supposed magic of them. In the face of an increasing widespread blind faith in data-driven technologies, we argue for grounding machine learning-based practices and untethering them from hype and fear cycles. And then one path forward is to develop a rich methodological framework for addressing the strengths and weaknesses of doing data analysis. And I thought this was really interesting, actually, because recently, in the last couple of years, I came up with this term critihype that Cory Doctorow, our mutual buddy, picked up on. And I've really been pointing to, you were talking about it earlier in your legal technical solutionism piece about how it's critics so often go along with the power. But what I really like, and it's something I'm saying in this essay too, is your focus on method, being close to the technology, what you were saying earlier, and really studying what's going on because I'm a way forward between this kind of Scylla and Charybdis of of hype and fear as the two poles, right? So say a bit about that.
Yeah. No, it was really fun, Madeline and I working on this, and I can still picture all of the late night conversations we had. But our part of it is we're both ethnographers, right?
Yes.
And so the result of this is that we spend a lot of time thinking about the role of reflexivity.
Yeah.
Right? What does it mean to be attentive to your own relationship to the things you are studying, and how are you shaping and changing the systems around you? Especially when we take on a Karen Barad approach, right? Which is just the very idea that our presence will actually, really influence everything around us. And we thought it was so funny because we're watching, all of these folks who are, professionals making these decisions around these things that we would call now AI. Everything from choices around the algorithm, but also data cleaning choices, and how to deal with, different kinds of anomalies and all of these things. And we're like, dude, that's the stuff we do too. And we talk a lot about reflexivity about this, but they're not even in a culture to be reflexive. And of course, I would say, I want to pinpoint that there's an interesting train of computer science work that actually has come forward since I think about data sets for data, or data sheets for data sets, right? What does it mean to be reflexive about what a data set is? That's great. So I don't want to say there's nothing, but we were just wait a minute, what is this practice that we've been socialized into a set of things that we would call method that, allow us to see and understand the limits of our own sight? And what does it mean that, these folks have been socialized into something where it's just what you're doing is just the junk work to get the important work, which is the perfect algorithm. And you're none of this is perfect.
Yeah.
And part of it was also interesting is that we'd spend a lot of time, just talking to people in the industry. Of course, they were coming through data and society all the time. And they were anxious. They were nervous about what they were doing. They didn't know the consequences of their own decisions. They didn't feel like there was room to navigate and choose and make sense of it. So they felt as though their method had been so much constrained. And with that, I would argue that's only gotten worse, right? Which is that they're, somebody's building something off of data that they take for granted, right? And then they're pulling down other pieces from GitHub or whatever to pair together, and they're hoping it works as explained in the text. And you're like, oh gosh, right? This is Frankenstein, people, right? This is truly Frankenstein. And so that was, in the early days before we went into this full blown mania movement of AI, we were a little bit more hopeful to get a lot of people that were doing this data work. And there was many people that were in our circles and we were engaging with, to just be able to be more reflective and reflexive. And, this will of course become, core to the fact universe, right? The fairness, accountability, and transparency in computing and machine learning. And, this great work that was done by a team of people, including really I think the originator is Solon Barakis. We would come. I was helping make it into an ACM conference. Madeline would go on to actually also be a chair of a future one. So we were all trying to be okay, how do we put this in there? And of course, things with the hype, things just got really weird.
Yeah.
And so in some ways, I look at that because I think it's important to do it. And I also think there's something that we miss there about really grappling with what would happen in high-speed power dynamics. And lately I've been coming back more and more to Manuel Castell's work for this reason, because I think that his work is more helpful for seeing this. And so, for those who don't know, Communication Power, which is one of his later books, he has this infuriating category scheme of network power, networked power, networking power, and network making power.
Okay.
Which is really challenging. But the basic idea is that power exists within networks, and then we learn how to see our own positions within it, and then we learn how to actually, make connections in order to actually build this, or we are in a position of ultimate power where we can actually make the network as a whole, right? And it's a critique of things like Murdoch. And I think that this is really important because, we often get enrolled in other people's network making activities and don't realize it. And in a moment of extreme hype, which is what we're in, we're seeing that mass enrollment, if you will, in there. And so I'm just grappling with what that looks like. And so we were at the time thinking of a very different theory of power, thinking about the role in which the engineers who had a lot more power and authority in that phase could start to resist some of the systemic issues that were coming. And I would argue that the power dynamic has shifted so much that the arrangement is very different right now. But I still, at these moments where you're just like, okay, how do we, what are the appropriate theories of change to deal with this particular configuration?
Yeah, that's interesting. What do you think? Do you have an answer to your question yet?
So we all know that this is caught up in capitalism. Like, you got to be hiding under a rock to think otherwise. I'm struggling with what it means when we have, 4 or 5 companies controlling the majority of the S&P 500. And that means that every university endowment is dependent on it. And that means that, pension funds for government employees and all of this other stuff. So there's layers of dependency that I don't think we've factored in, which is keeping this machine at its most egregious. For the longest time, it was sort of interesting because I, was sort of fascinated by the competition for engineers, right? Like high tech salaries of people who are paid, through their stock, which I always find also fascinating, coming from, leftist circles where everybody's just like, you should be part of the company and own part of the company. I'm like, that exists and doesn't necessarily land where you imagine it to. Because it also means that, the CFOs have an incentive to keep the stock price going high in order to retain talent. Of course, that's really weird right now because the number of talent that they're focused on in AI is so small, and they're hoping that, everybody else's technical ability can be manifested through AI so they don't have to pay them. So we're in this like really disruptive phase. And I mean, this is where I struggle, and this is where like history is never really optimistic here because all of these stories tend to end with, war as the thing that really creates the break. And of course, we've got two hot wars and a cold war going on right now, and you're just like, let it not turn into a global war. But I struggle with what it means to rearrange this, and it's not because I think that everybody in tech is malevolent and greedy, right? I understand where that impulse comes from. I think it's more that, there aren't the conditions where we think about the collective, right? The whole point is to think much more locally. And when we're doing this at global scale, we're going far beyond Ford's, ideas that he needed Detroit to function so that he could keep his, wealth growing. So I'm really struck by where this is going to end up landing. And every spidey sense of me is just like, it's not pretty. And I would like to think that it's not going to land with authoritarian takeovers, but again, history doesn't give me a lot of confidence on that. So it's a very odd time. And I look to people that honestly have much more radical theories of change than I ever have. And I think that in many ways, I'm grateful for them right now because I find that the pragmatic theories of change are falling short right now.
Boy, so on to
Sorry,
one more
really optimistic.
one more depressing topic though before we say goodbye today. Can we talk for a second about degradation?
Ah, yes.
So you've been thinking about degradation recently?
Yeah. What makes you think that? Lee knows that I'm trying to pull together some people to think about it because, you know, it starts, obviously with our SDS orientation towards infrastructure, right? And I've been thinking a lot about ways in which infrastructures don't just break, but they just decay. They just crumble apart. And so I've
Yeah.
been, with the census work, I've been thinking a lot about what I call Jenga politics. So if you think about the wooden board game of Jenga, the gameplay is to take out pieces of the infrastructure and put more pressure on top of the infrastructure, all to make it vulnerable so that somebody else will actually make the whole thing crash and you get to win as a result. Right. And there's something really fascinating about this because I feel like this is a metaphor for what's happening with the administrative state in the US. It's just falling apart. And it's falling apart little by little, right? We have Chevron in the courts that's going to actually do a nightmare. We have Schedule F, lingering in these terrifying ways. There's all of these things that are happening that are just going to make the administrative state weak. And so I've just been thinking about, what happens when we take systems for granted? We assume that they'll function. And what happens when they just start to degrade at something downstream? And then, I went to a set of meetings where we were thinking about socio-technical resilience and thinking about what it means, if we're having these conversations about AI, what does it mean for there to be resilience around the organizations and the knowledge, right? Because if, we've already seen it with things like Stack Overflow, where people are like, I'm not volunteering contributing to an AI. I'm volunteering contributing to my colleagues because I've actually embraced a Marcel Mauss notion of the gift without even realizing it. And so when the gift turns into a different form of social and economic exchange that feels exploitative, people are like, forget the gift. I ain't giving anybody a gift. Right. And so the result is we start to degrade the, kinds of infrastructure that we're so dependent on. And so I keep thinking about where that plays out. And, of course, degradation is interesting to me because some things are supposed to degrade, right? And that's okay. Like I think about my Polaroids from college, right? Those were never going to be collectibles because they were always going to degrade. So degradation to me isn't inherently a bad thing, but it's something that we have to attend to. And this, of course, is entirely inspired by the work that you've been doing, thinking about maintenance and repair. And part of it is that, as I look to the work that and the networks that you've built, for which I am so grateful in the maintenance and repair world, I think maintenance and repair assumes that you're aware of these vulnerabilities within the system. And one of the things that I'm finding, especially in our AI conversation or in the ridiculous thing of administrative states, is these things are degrading in a way that people aren't even seeing
That's interesting.
the possibility of maintenance and repair as necessary until it's way too late. And so I'm trying to figure out how to think about that and to draw from your thinking, connect these dots and figure out how we can put this together. But to be determined.
Yeah, we'll
question mark,
see.
question mark.
And I like how you've brought in Corey's enshittification idea too, because I
That's
think
such a great phrase.
Yeah, well, I think he's just onto something. I mean, I think that I don't know what Google search looks like for you, or if you still use it, but it's certainly gotten
dreadful.
worse for me. And I
think, I mean, this is exactly so. Corey's enshittification, he really is focused on platforms, right? That is his heart and soul, and he's interested in how these commercial platforms that once they, they start by trying to get your attention and exciting and like, look, this is all new and shiny and sparkly. And then they succeed at this. And then you use them and you rely on them and they're really great. And now they have to be in maintenance mode, or like make new shiny things. And so the top engineers don't want to work on them and all the things around them start to change. And so it's just like, it starts to be this mode. And so he calls it enshittification, which is a way of thinking about the degradation of the quality of the experience. Of using any of these tools. And we all feel it in different ways. And the other thing is, of course, the next level to it, which he also recognizes, is that, the repair work comes in the form of really crappy AI, like, patchwork. Yes. And so, the best place that I always think about this is like, trying to do any form of customer service at all anymore, right? Which is like, you spend the time on the phone being like, agent, right? If you're lucky to even have a phone call to call, because like, and so this is this moment about like, why we are accepting crappier and crappier experiences. And how much is that starting to feel like, we're the frogs that are boiling?
Yeah, man. Well, I think it's a great topic, and I'm looking forward to the hangout where we'll jawbone on it with folks. Danah, thank you so much. This was a lot of fun, like I knew it would be, and thank you so much for all your work over the years. It's been a big inspiration, and thanks for coming on today.
Thank you. Likewise.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of our podcast. You can reach us with questions, comments, and suggestions at leevinsel@gmail.com or by following me on Twitter at STS_news or on YouTube at People's Things. Our podcast is distributed by the New Books Network, the leading platform for academic podcasts, so that you can find us wherever you get your podcasts. Peoples and Things, like most things in this world, depends on the work of many people. I want to thank my brother Jake Vinsel for writing the music for the show. I want to thank my buddy Juliana Castro for designing the logos for the podcast. You can check out her work at julianacastro.co. Joe Ford is the producer for the podcast, and Mandy Lamb is the production assistant. This podcast and other Peoples and Things programming are produced in affiliation with Virginia Tech Publishing and supported by the Center for Humanities and the University Libraries at Virginia Tech. For information about other podcasts from Virginia Tech Publishing, visit publishing.vt.edu. For the entire Peoples and Things team, I am Lee Vinsel. And most importantly, I want to thank you for listening. Thanks.